On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Joseph Williams stood at the edge of his feedlot in Ringgold County, Iowa, and watched 43 head of cattle die before noon. Not all at once, not dramatically. They went the way sick cattle always go. Quietly, first, then not quietly at all. A stagger, a drop, a sound that anyone who has ever heard it never forgets and never fully describes to someone who hasn't. By the time the county veterinarian's truck came up the gravel road trailing a rooster tail of frozen dust, Joseph had already lost 11. By the time Dr. Gerald Foss climbed out with his bag and his clipboard and his expression that said he had seen this before, the number was 16. Joseph Williams was 58 years old and had farmed the same 640 acres in Ringgold County for 34 years. His father had farmed it before him, and his grandfather before that, and the land had a way of making a man feel both permanent and fragile at the same time. Permanent because the soil was still there. Fragile because everything you put on top of it could be gone in a season. He ran 180 head of mixed Angus and Hereford cattle on 200 acres of pasture and hay ground, and the rest went to corn and beans in a rotation that his father had established in 1948, and that Joseph had not seen any reason to change. He was not a man who changed things without reason. He was not a man who panicked easily. But standing in that feedlot on that Tuesday morning in March, watching Gerald Foss move from animal to animal with a growing stillness in his face that was worse than any diagnosis, Joseph Williams felt something he had not felt in 34 years of farming. He felt helpless. Let me tell you about what Gerald Foss found, because it matters to everything that follows. The cattle were dying of something that looked, on the surface, like hardware disease, the catch-all term for when cattle ingest metal debris and it perforates the reticulum, the second stomach chamber, causing infection and organ failure. Foss had seen hardware disease. He knew what it looked like. He knew what it cost. Usually 1 or 2 animals before you caught it, a few $100s in losses, a lesson learned about keeping your pastures and feedlots clean. What he was looking at in Joseph Williams' feedlot was not that. The pattern was wrong. The speed was wrong. The animals affected were wrong. Not just the older, slower animals who might have ingested debris over months, but young stock, yearlings, animals that had been healthy and gaining weight 10 days ago. Foss took blood. He took tissue samples from the 2 animals that had died before he arrived. He walked the feedlot twice, slowly, looking at the feed, the water, the ground. He came back to where Joseph was standing, and he said something that Joseph would repeat for the rest of his life to anyone who would listen. He said, "I don't know what this is." 3 words, from a man with a veterinary degree from Iowa State, 22 years of large animal practice, and a reputation in 4 counties as the best diagnostician between Des Moines and the Missouri border. "I don't know what this is." Joseph asked him what they should do. Foss said they would send the samples to the state lab in Ames, and in the meantime he would treat symptomatically. Antibiotics, supportive care, isolate the animals that were showing early signs. He said it with the careful confidence of a man who had been trained to project certainty even when he didn't feel it, and Joseph recognized that performance because he had used it himself, telling his wife things were going to be fine when he wasn't sure they were. By the end of the day, the count was 23. Let me tell you about the week that followed, because it was the kind of week that changes a man's relationship with everything he thought he knew. The state lab in Ames took 5 days to return preliminary results, and the results were inconclusive. They confirmed infection, a systemic bacterial infection affecting multiple organ systems. But the specific pathogen wasn't clearly identified, and the pattern of transmission within the herd was unusual. Foss consulted with a colleague at Iowa State's College of Veterinary Medicine, a specialist in bovine medicine named Dr. Patricia Hensley, who drove down from Ames on a Thursday and walked the operation with the same careful attention that Foss had shown, and reached the same careful conclusion. They didn't know exactly what they were dealing with. They had theories. They had treatment protocols based on those theories. They were going to try 3 different antibiotic regimens simultaneously in different isolated groups and see what worked. Joseph lost 4 more animals while they were talking. By the end of the second week, the count was 31. 31 head out of 180, dead or so compromised they would never regain weight, never breed, never produce. At current cattle prices, Joseph was looking at somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000 in direct losses. And that was before you counted the treatment costs, the veterinary fees, the disruption to his breeding program, the animals that survived but came out the other side diminished. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man who had good years and bad years and managed the distance between them carefully. And this was not a bad year. This was a catastrophe. Foss came out on a Friday afternoon of the second week and sat with Joseph at the kitchen table and laid out what he knew and what he didn't know in the honest, measured way that Joseph had always respected about him. The antibiotic regimens were having some effect. The progression had slowed, but the animals that were already sick were not recovering the way they should. There was something in the environment, Foss believed, something in the feedlot or the hay or the water that was compromising the animals' immune response and making them susceptible to infection in the first place. Until they identified that factor and eliminated it, they were treating symptoms, not causes. He was going to bring in a nutritionist from the extension office. He was going to have the water tested again. He was going to consult with 2 more specialists. He was going to do everything that the current state of veterinary science in 1987 could do for Joseph Williams' herd. Joseph's wife, Margaret, refilled their coffee cups and didn't say anything. Their son, Kevin, who was 24 and had come back to the farm after 2 years at community college, sat in the corner of the kitchen and listened. After Foss left, Kevin said, "Dad, what about Grandma Eunice's book?" And Joseph looked at his son for a long moment and said, "That's not medicine, Kevin." And Kevin said, "I know." And neither of them said anything else about it that night. Let me tell you about Ununice Williams, because you cannot understand what happened next without understanding the woman first. Ununice Williams was Joseph's grandmother on his father's side, born in 1891 in a farmhouse 3 miles from where Joseph's house now stood, on ground that was already Williams' ground by then. She had grown up in the era before county veterinarians, before extension services, before the systematic professionalization of American agriculture, an era when the knowledge of how to keep animals alive lived not in institutions, but in people, specifically in the women who managed the household animals, the kitchen gardens, the medicinal plants, the small-scale remedies that kept a working farm functional between the rare visits of a doctor or a vet. Ununice had been one of those women. She had been, by all accounts, exceptional at it. She had a memory that her family described as photographic and a curiosity that was, for a woman of her time and place, almost unseemly in its intensity. She had read everything she could get her hands on: agricultural bulletins, herbal medicine texts, the letters and journals of other farm women, the old German and Scandinavian remedies that the immigrant families in the county had brought with them from the old country. And she had kept a book. Not a diary, not a recipe book. A working document, added to over decades, that recorded every treatment she had ever used on an animal or a person, with the plant or substance used, the preparation method, the dosage, the result, and her own notes on what she thought was happening physiologically. She had started it in 1912 and added to it until 1958, the year before she died, and by the end it ran to 214 pages in her small, precise handwriting, organized by ailment rather than by plant, cross-referenced by season and by animal type, annotated with observations that sometimes ran for pages and sometimes were a single word. She had given it to Joseph's father when she died, and Joseph's father had kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk for 28 years without opening it, and when Joseph's father died in 1971, the book had passed to Joseph, who had kept it in the same drawer for another 16 years with the same level of attention. Kevin had found it at age 19, reading it the way young people sometimes read old things. Not for practical use, but out of a sense that the past contained something the present had forgotten. He had mentioned it to Joseph once, years ago, and Joseph had said something dismissive about folk remedies and old wives' tales, and the subject had been dropped. Now, in the second week of a catastrophe that the best veterinary minds in southern Iowa could not diagnose, Kevin brought it up again. He brought the book to the table the next morning without asking permission. It was a composition book, the old kind with the black and white marbled cover, but thicker than a standard composition book. Eunice had added pages, stitching them in with a careful hand, so that the spine was swollen and the cover didn't quite close flat. Joseph looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he picked it up. Let me tell you about what Ununice Williams had written, because it is the reason this story is still being told. On page 47, under the heading Cattle Sickness, Winter and Spring, Feedlot and Barn, Eunice had written a description of a syndrome she called slow death fever, which was not a medical term but a descriptive one. Animals that appeared healthy, then declined gradually over days or weeks, with staggering, dropping, and a systemic infection that resisted the common remedies of her day. She had seen it first in 1919, lost 7 animals to it before she understood what was happening, and then seen it again in 1931 and in 1944. She had identified, through observation and through correspondence with 2 other farm women in neighboring counties who had seen the same thing, that the syndrome appeared almost exclusively in late winter and early spring, in animals that had been confined to feedlots or barns through the winter, and that it was associated with specific conditions. A combination of what she called sour hay, meaning hay that had been cut and baled in wet conditions and had developed a particular smell and a particular texture, and what she described as standing water in the lot that had gone through repeated freeze-thaw cycles and had taken on a greenish or brownish cast. She had written in her careful hand, "The animals are not dying of the fever. The fever is what happens after. They are dying because something in the bad hay or the bad water has made them unable to fight what they would otherwise fight off easily. Remove the source and treat what has already taken hold, and most of them will recover. The ones that don't recover are the ones that have been eating the bad hay or drinking the bad water the longest." Joseph read that passage 3 times. Then he put the book down and looked at Kevin. Kevin looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Joseph said quietly, "Where's our hay from this year?" And Kevin said, the Henderson's field, the one that got rained on twice before we got it in. And, Joseph said, and the south lot water tank. Kevin said, it's been freezing and thawing since November. There's been some green on it. I've been meaning to talk to you about that. Joseph stood up from the table and put on his coat and went out to the feedlot. Let me tell you about what Joseph Williams did in the next 48 hours, because this is where the story turns. He pulled every bale of the Henderson hay out of the feedlot and the barn, all of it. 340 bales, moved by hand and by tractor, stacked in the field away from any animal. He drained the south lot water tank completely, scrubbed it with a solution that Eunice's book specified, a mixture involving wood ash lye and what she called good vinegar, which Joseph interpreted as apple cider vinegar, applied with a stiff brush and rinsed 3 times with clean water. He brought in fresh hay from a different source, hay he had bought from a neighbor the previous fall that had been baled dry and stored in a closed barn. He ran fresh water lines to temporary tanks in the feedlot. He did all of this without calling Foss, without calling the extension nutritionist, without consulting anyone. He did it because his grandmother had written it down in 1919, and he believed her. Then he called Foss and told him what he had done and why. The silence on the phone lasted long enough that Joseph thought the connection had dropped. Then Foss said, "Joseph, I appreciate that you're trying to do something, but you understand that what you're describing is not," and he paused, choosing his words, "it's not a recognized syndrome. The contaminated hay theory has some merit from a mycotoxin standpoint, but the water contamination you're describing, the freeze-thaw cycling, that's not a known vector for the kind of systemic infection we're seeing. I don't want you to get your hopes up based on He paused again. Based on old notes. Joseph said, "I understand." He said it the way a man says it when he doesn't intend to change what he's doing, but sees no point in arguing. Foss said he would be out Monday to check on the animals. Joseph said that would be fine. They hung up. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 10 days because the numbers tell the story better than anything else. The herd stopped dying. Not immediately. 2 more animals died in the first 72 hours after Joseph changed the hay and the water, animals that had been too far gone before the change was made. But after those 2, the progression stopped. The animals that had been showing early signs, the slight stagger, the reduced appetite, the dull eyes, began to stabilize. By the end of the first week, 3 of the stabilized animals were showing clear improvement, eating normally, moving normally, beginning to regain the alertness that sick cattle lose first and regain last. By the end of the second week, Joseph had lost 33 animals total, but the remaining 147 were alive, and 8 of the previously sick animals had recovered to the point where Foss, arriving on that Monday as promised, stood in the feedlot and said nothing for a very long time. He walked the lot. He examined the recovering animals. He looked at the new hay, the clean tanks, the fresh water lines. He came back to where Joseph was standing and he said, "How?" Just that one word. Joseph told him about Eunice's book. He told him about slow death fever, about the sour hay, about the freeze-thaw water contamination, about the theory that the animals were being immunocompromised before the infection took hold. Foss listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Joseph finished, Foss asked if he could see the book. Joseph went inside and got it and handed it to Foss, who stood in the cold morning air and read the relevant pages twice, slowly, the way a man reads something that is reorganizing what he thought he knew. Then Foss said something that Joseph did not expect. He said she was describing mycotoxicosis. The sour hay baled in wet conditions develops fungal contamination, and some of those fungi produce mycotoxins that suppress immune function in cattle. It's been documented in veterinary literature since the 1960s, but the specific combination she's describing, the hay contamination plus the freeze-thaw water quality issue, there's actually a 1984 paper from the University of Minnesota that touches on this interaction. He looked up from the book. He said, "She figured this out in 1919. Joseph said, "She figured it out because she was paying attention." Foss nodded slowly. He said, "I want to send this book to Dr. Hensley at Iowa State, with your permission. I want her to read it." Joseph thought about it for a moment and said, "You can show her the relevant pages. The rest of it stays here. Let me tell you about what Dr. Patricia Hensley said when she read those pages, because it matters to what came after." Hensley was a scientist, which meant she was trained to be skeptical of anecdotal evidence, and she was skeptical of Unice's book in the way that a good scientist is skeptical. Not dismissively, but rigorously. She asked questions. She wanted to know the sample sizes, the controls, the variables. She understood, of course, that a farm woman in 1919 had not been running controlled experiments. But she also understood something that the best scientists always understand, which is that careful observation over a long period of time, recorded honestly and without agenda, is a form of data. Not the cleanest form, not the most rigorous form, but data nonetheless. And what Ununice Williams had recorded across 46 years of observation was, when Hensley looked at it through the lens of what was known in 1987, remarkably consistent with documented veterinary science on mycotoxin-related immunosuppression in cattle. The specific combination of conditions Ununice had identified, wet-baled hay plus freeze-thaw water contamination in late winter feedlot conditions, was not something that had been formally studied as a syndrome, but the components were individually documented, and the interaction Ununice had described was plausible and, given what had happened to Joseph's herd, apparently real. Hensley wrote a letter to Foss. She said she intended to design a formal study around the conditions Ununice had described. She said she believed there was something there worth investigating. She said, and this is the part that Foss read aloud to Joseph at the kitchen table on a cold April evening with Margaret and Kevin listening, she said, "The woman who wrote these notes was not practicing folk medicine. She was practicing epidemiology. She just didn't have the word for it." Joseph didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "She would have liked hearing that. Let me tell you about the summer that followed, because the story doesn't end with the herd surviving. The 147 surviving animals came through the spring in better shape than Joseph had dared to hope. The 8 animals that had been sick and recovered were slower to regain condition than he would have liked. But by June, they were indistinguishable from the animals that had never been sick, and by the time Joseph sorted his calves in July, the calf crop from the surviving cows was strong enough that the year's losses, devastating as they had been, did not break him. They hurt him. They changed the trajectory of the next 2 or 3 years. But they did not break him, and a man who has been farming for 34 years knows the difference. He made 2 changes that summer that he kept for the rest of his farming life. The first was that he never again bought hay that had been rained on before baling, regardless of the price, regardless of the convenience, regardless of what the seller told him about how it had dried out fine. The second was that he began checking his water tanks through the winter with the attention he had not previously given them, draining and cleaning them on a schedule rather than when they looked like they needed it. These were not dramatic changes. They were not the kind of changes that get written up in the farm magazines or talked about at the co-op. They were the kind of changes that a man makes quietly in response to a lesson that cost him 33 animals and $20,000 and 2 weeks of the worst fear he had felt since his father died. Kevin noticed both changes without commenting on them. He was learning that summer what it meant to farm. Not the mechanics of it, which he already knew, but the epistemology of it. The question of how you know what you know, and where that knowledge comes from and what you do when the knowledge you have isn't enough. He had grown up watching his father trust the extension service, trust the veterinarian, trust the seed company agronomist, trust the institutions that American agriculture had built to carry the knowledge that individual farmers couldn't carry alone. And those institutions had failed his father in March of 1987, or not failed him exactly, but come up short, come up with I don't know and let's try this and we'll see. And his great-great-grandmother's book, written in a composition notebook with stitched-in pages in a farmhouse 3 miles away, had not come up short, had known, had seen it before, had written it down. Kevin thought about that a lot that summer. He didn't say much about it to Joseph, but he thought about it. Let me tell you about the conversation at the Ringgold County Co-op in August of 1987, because it is the moment when the story became something more than a private family matter. Joseph was not a man who talked about his business at the co-op. He bought his supplies, he collected his mail, he exchanged the necessary pleasantries with the men he had known for 30 years, and he went home. But in August, a man named Roy Cartwright, who ran 220 head of cattle on a spread north of Diagonal and who had heard through the county grapevine about Joseph's spring losses, stopped Joseph near the seed display and asked him, straight out, what had happened with his herd. Roy was not a gossip. He was a careful man asking a careful question, and Joseph recognized the difference. Joseph told him. He told him about the Henderson hay, about the South Lot water tank, about Eunice's book, about what Foss had eventually confirmed about mycotoxins and immune suppression. He told him about slow death fever and what his grandmother had written in 1919. Roy listened without interrupting, the way farmers listen when they are actually listening rather than waiting to talk. When Joseph finished, Roy said, "I had 3 animals last February that went the way you're describing. Vet said it was hardware disease. I lost all 3. Joseph said, "What kind of hay were you feeding?" Roy thought about it and said, "Bought some from a guy over in Decatur County. It had gotten wet. I got it cheap." Joseph said, "That's probably what it was." Roy said, "You're telling me my grandmother might have known that." Joseph said, "I'm telling you my grandmother definitely knew that." Roy Cartwright changed his hay sourcing that fall. He never lost another animal to what he called the slow death, though he used that term only with Joseph, and only when they were alone. Let me tell you about what Gerald Foss did with what he had learned, because this is the part of the story that moves beyond one farm and one family. Foss was not a man who was comfortable being wrong. He was a good veterinarian precisely because he held himself to a high standard, and being wrong about Joseph Williams' herd, not catastrophically wrong, not negligently wrong, but genuinely, helplessly wrong in the way that a good doctor is sometimes wrong when a disease presents unusually, had stayed with him. He had gone back to the veterinary literature on mycotoxins with a new attention, and he had found the 1984 University of Minnesota paper that he had mentioned to Joseph, and he had found 2 other papers from the late 1970s that touched on related phenomena, and he had begun to understand that the syndrome Ununice Williams had described was real, was documented in pieces across the scientific literature, but had never been assembled into a coherent clinical picture that a practicing veterinarian in southern Iowa would recognize when he saw it. He wrote a case report. It was not a formal research paper. He was a practicing vet, not an academic, and he didn't have the institutional infrastructure for a formal study. But he wrote a careful description of what he had observed in Joseph Williams' herd, what he had done and what had failed, what Joseph had done and what had worked, and the connection to Ununice Williams's recorded observations. He cited the relevant scientific literature. He described the syndrome as he now understood it, a 2-factor immunosuppression event in late winter feedlot cattle, driven by mycotoxin exposure from wet-baled hay combined with opportunistic bacterial infection facilitated by compromised immune function, potentially exacerbated by water quality issues in freeze-thaw conditions. He sent the case report to the Iowa Veterinary Medical Association's journal. They published it in the spring of 1988. It was a short piece, 4 pages, and it ran in the back of the journal where the case reports always ran, and it was read by perhaps 200 veterinarians across Iowa and the surrounding states. But 200 veterinarians is not nothing, and the case report included, in its acknowledgments section, a sentence that Foss had written carefully and that Joseph had approved. The initial identification of this syndrome was made not by a trained veterinarian, but by a farm woman named Ununice Williams of Ringgold County, Iowa, who recorded her observations between 1919 and 1958. Her notes, preserved by her family, provided the diagnostic framework that led to resolution of this outbreak. Her contribution to the understanding of this syndrome is primary. Joseph read that sentence 6 times when the journal arrived. Then he put the journal in the drawer where the book lived, next to the book, and he didn't say anything to anyone about it for a week. Let me tell you about the drawer, because it matters. The drawer was the bottom drawer of the same desk that had belonged to Joseph's father, and, before that, to Joseph's grandfather. It was a roll-top desk, the old kind with the tambour cover that rattled when you opened it, and it sat in the corner of the farmhouse living room that had been designated as the office since before Joseph was born. The drawer had always been the place where important things were kept. Documents, deeds, the kind of papers that a family accumulates over generations of staying in one place. The book had been in that drawer for 44 years by 1987, and now the journal lived there too, and Joseph began to think of the drawer differently than he had before. Not as a place where old things were stored, but as a place where knowledge was kept. The distinction mattered to him, though he couldn't have explained precisely why. Kevin understood it without being told. He had grown up in that house, had known the drawer all his life, had thought of it as a place where old things went that nobody needed any more. After 1987, he thought of it differently too. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story of Ununice Williams' book did not end with the journal article, or with the herd recovering, or with Roy Cartwright changing his hay sourcing. It continued, the way knowledge continues when it is finally released from the drawer where it has been sitting. Dr. Patricia Hensley at Iowa State did design a study, as she had said she intended to. It took 3 years to get funding and another 2 years to complete, and the results were published in 1993 in the Journal of Veterinary Diagnostic Investigation. The study confirmed, in the rigorous controlled manner that science requires, the basic mechanism that Ununice Williams had identified through observation. Mycotoxin-contaminated hay produced a measurable suppression of bovine immune function, and this suppression was significantly worsened by concurrent exposure to bacterially contaminated water in late winter feedlot conditions. The paper cited Foss's 1988 case report. The case report cited Ununice Williams. The chain of attribution ran from a peer-reviewed scientific journal in 1993 back to a composition notebook in 1919, and the chain held. Hensley sent Joseph a copy of the paper with a handwritten note. The note said, "Your grandmother was right. We just proved it." Joseph put the paper in the drawer. The drawer was getting full. Let me tell you about Kevin Williams in 1995, because by then he was running the farm and the story had entered a new phase. Kevin was 32 in 1995 and had been the primary operator of the Williams farm for 3 years, since Joseph's health had begun to decline in ways that made the physical demands of full-time farming difficult. Joseph was still there, still present, still the authority on questions that Kevin brought to him, but the daily decisions were Kevin's, and Kevin had grown into them with the same quiet competence that Joseph had always shown, and that Ununice, from what the book revealed, had shown before him. He ran the same 640 acres, the same mixed cattle operation, the same corn and bean rotation, with modifications he had made carefully and for documented reasons. He had added a small hay operation, growing and baling his own hay on 40 acres, because after 1987 he was not willing to depend on outside hay sources for his cattle feed. He baled only in dry conditions. He had a moisture meter, and he used it. These were not dramatic innovations. They were the application of a lesson. He had also read the book, all 214 pages of it. He had read it the way his mother read the Bible, not once through and done, but repeatedly, returning to different sections and different seasons, finding things he had missed the previous time. Ununice's book was not organized the way a textbook is organized. It was organized the way a mind is organized, associatively, with connections that were sometimes obvious and sometimes required you to hold 2 pages in your head simultaneously to see what she was getting at. Kevin had learned to read it that way. He had begun adding his own notes in the margins, carefully, in pencil, so they could be distinguished from Ununice's ink. He noted where her observations aligned with what he had read in current veterinary and agricultural literature. He noted where they diverged and what might account for the divergence. He noted questions he couldn't answer. He had shown the book to his daughter Emma when she was 14, not as a lesson in folk medicine, but as a lesson in observation. He had said, "Your great-great-great-grandmother wrote this down because she was paying attention. That's all she was doing. She was paying attention and writing it down." Emma had read the relevant cattle sections and the sections on poultry, and the long section on soil and plant relationships that Ununice had compiled from correspondence with a woman in Nebraska who kept bees and had opinions about clover. Emma had said, "Dad, she was writing about the microbiome. She just didn't call it that." Kevin had looked at his daughter for a long moment and then said, "Yes, that's exactly right. Let me tell you about Joseph Williams' last years, because the end of a man's life is part of his story, and Joseph's end was consistent with his life in the ways that matter." Joseph died in January of 2001 at the age of 71 of a heart condition that had been developing for several years and that he had managed with the same patient, methodical attention he gave to everything. He died in the farmhouse where he had been born, in the bed where his parents had slept, in a county where his family had farmed for 4 generations. Kevin was with him. Margaret was with him. Emma, who was 20 and in her second year at Iowa State studying animal science, drove through the night to be there and arrived 2 hours before the end. The funeral was at the Methodist Church in Kellerton, and it was well attended in the way that the funerals of farmers who have lived in one place for a long time are well attended. Not because Joseph had been a public figure or a prominent man, but because he had been a reliable one, and in a small county, reliability is a form of distinction. Gerald Foss came, though he had retired from practice 2 years earlier. Roy Cartwright came. Several men came whose names Joseph would have recognized, but whose connection to him was indirect. Farmers who had read Foss's 1988 case report, or who had heard the story through the county network, and who felt that the man who had figured out what was killing his cattle deserved to be marked. Kevin spoke at the service. He said that his father had taught him 2 things above all others. The first was that the land remembers what you do to it, and you had better be paying attention to what it's telling you. The second was that knowledge doesn't have a credential. It has a track record. He said his father had learned both of those things from a book in a drawer, written by a woman who had been dead for 28 years before the book saved his herd. He said he intended to teach his daughter the same things. Emma, sitting in the front pew, was already crying. She'd been crying since Kevin started speaking, but when he said that last part, she stopped crying and sat up straight, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has just understood something that they have been circling for a long time without quite seeing. Let me tell you about Emma Williams, because she is the reason this story is still moving forward, rather than simply backward. Emma Williams graduated from Iowa State in 2003 with a degree in animal science and a minor in plant biology, and she came home to the Williams farm with a head full of current science and a deep familiarity with a 214-page composition notebook that she had been reading since she was 14. She was not the same kind of farmer that Joseph had been or that Kevin was. She was not better. That's not the right word. She was different in a specific way. She moved between the book and the journals, between Unice's observations and the current literature, with a fluency that neither Joseph nor Kevin had possessed, because she had been trained in both simultaneously rather than coming to one after the other. She could read a passage in Unice's book about soil and plant relationships and cross-reference it with current research on mycorrhizal networks and see not just that Unice had been right, but why she had been right, what the mechanism was, what the implications were for things Unice hadn't written about because she hadn't lived long enough to see them. She made changes to the farm. Careful changes, documented changes, changes she argued for at the kitchen table the way Unice had presumably argued for her observations at her own kitchen table 80 years earlier. She introduced cover crops into the corn and bean rotation, citing research on soil health and water retention and the long-term economics of reduced input costs. Kevin listened and said he needed to think about it, which was his version of yes, and the following spring they planted cereal rye on 80 acres between the corn harvest and the spring planting. The results in the first year were modest. The results in the third year were not modest. The results in the 5th year were the kind of results that make neighboring farmers slow down when they drive past your fields. She added a note to the book. She wrote it in pencil, the way Kevin had written his notes, so it could be distinguished from Unice's ink. She wrote, cover crops confirmed. Soil moisture retention up 23% in dry years. Input costs down $34 per acre over 5 years. Eunice wrote about keeping the ground covered in winter. She was right about this too. She just didn't have the yield data. She signed it with her initials and the year, EW 2009. Let me tell you about the summer of 2012, because it was the summer that tested everything. The drought of 2012 was the worst drought in the Midwest since 1988, and in some parts of Iowa, it was the worst since the 1930s. The corn crop across the state was devastated. Farmers who had planted wall-to-wall corn, which was most of them because corn prices had been strong and the temptation to maximize corn acres was one that most operators had given into, were looking at yield losses of 40, 50, 60%. The cattle market was disrupted because hay was scarce and expensive, and the pasture grass had burned up in July. It was the kind of year that broke people who were already close to the edge, and there were people in Ringgold County who were close to the edge. The Williams farm was not close to the edge. The cover-cropped fields held moisture through June in a way that the bare fields around them did not, and the corn that Emma had planted in those fields, at Kevin's insistence on a slightly lower population density than the agronomists recommended, based on a note in Eunice's book about not crowding plants in uncertain years, came through the drought with yields that were still down from a normal year, maybe 25% below what Emma had projected, but not the catastrophic losses that the neighbors were taking. The hay ground held up. The cattle came through the summer thin but functional, because Emma had adjusted their management in May when the weather patterns started to look wrong, reducing the grazing pressure on the pastures before the grass stressed out rather than after. She had made that decision based on a combination of the weather data she was watching and a passage in Eunice's book about reading the grass in dry springs, a passage that Kevin had underlined in pencil and that Emma had underlined again in a slightly different place, because she was reading it for a different reason. They didn't crow about it. That was not the Williams way. But the numbers were what they were, and in a small county, numbers travel. A man named Dennis Albright, who ran a large operation north of Mount Ayr and who had been farming for 40 years with the kind of confidence that 40 years of success produces, drove down the county road past the Williams fields in August of 2012 and stopped his truck and got out and looked at the corn for a long time. Then he drove to the Williams farm and knocked on the door. Emma answered it. He said, "I want to know what you're doing different." She said, "Come in." Kevin made coffee. Emma got the book. She didn't give it to him. She read him the relevant passages and explained the science behind them and told him what she had done and what the results had been and what she thought the mechanism was. Albright listened the way Roy Cartwright had listened to Joseph in 1987, without interrupting, with the specific quality of attention that a man pays when he is learning something he needed to know. When Emma finished, Albright said, "How old is that book?" Emma said, "She started it in 1912. Albright looked at the book for a moment and then looked at Emma and said, "And nobody knew about this?" Emma said, "We knew about it. We just kept it in a drawer." Albright went home and planted cereal rye that fall on 200 acres. The following spring, he planted it on 400. By 2015, he had cover crops on his entire operation, and his input costs had dropped enough that he talked about it openly at the co-op, which meant that other men started asking questions, which meant that the knowledge moved the way knowledge moves in small counties, person to person, field to field, slowly, and then all at once. let me tell you about the conference in Des Moines in 2014, because it is the moment when the book moved from a family document to something larger. Emma had been asked to speak at the Iowa Sustainable Agriculture Conference by a woman from the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State, who had heard about the Williams Farm's drought performance in 2012 and had driven down to see it herself. Emma had given her the same explanation she had given Dennis Albright: the cover crops, the stocking density adjustments, the moisture management, the long view on soil health, and had shown her the book, and the woman had said, "You need to tell this story to more people." Emma had said she would think about it. Kevin had said, "Emma, go." And so she went. She stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in Des Moines in front of 340 farmers and agronomists and extension agents and told the story of Ununice Williams' book. She told it from the beginning: the 1987 outbreak, the veterinarians who couldn't diagnose it, the drawer, the book, the slow death fever, the sour hay, the freeze-thaw water. She told it through the cover crops and the 2012 drought, and Dennis Albright stopping his truck on the county road. She had the book with her on the podium, and at one point she read directly from it, Eunice's description of keeping the ground covered in winter, of reading the grass in dry springs, of not crowding plants in uncertain years, and the room was very quiet while she read. Then she said, "This book was written by a woman who never went to college, who never had a research grant, who never published a paper. She wrote it because she was paying attention. She kept it because she believed it mattered. Her family kept it in a drawer for 44 years because they didn't know what else to do with it. And when they finally opened it, it saved 147 animals and eventually contributed to a peer-reviewed study at Iowa State and a change in how veterinarians in this state think about late winter feedlot disease." She looked out at the room. She said, "I want you to think about what else is in the drawers, what other notebooks, what other observations, what other careful records kept by people who were paying attention and had no institutional home for what they knew." The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. Let me tell you about the drawer now, because it is still there. The roll-top desk is still in the corner of the living room of the Williams farmhouse in Ringgold County, Iowa. Kevin is 61 now and still farming, though Emma makes most of the decisions and has for the last several years. The bottom drawer contains Eunice's book, Foss's 1988 case report, Hensley's 1993 journal article, Kevin's penciled marginal notes, Emma's penciled marginal notes, and a small stack of papers that Emma has been accumulating. Her own observations, written in the same careful hand that Eunice used, organized the same way, by ailment and season and result. She has not yet decided whether to bind them into the book or keep them separate. She is thinking about it. The book itself is in better shape than you might expect for a document that is 112 years old. Eunice used good ink, and the paper was acid-free by accident. It was the kind of composition notebook that was made before cost-cutting changed the paper stock, and the stitched-in pages have held. Emma had a conservator look at it in 2010, and the conservator said it would last another century with reasonable care. Emma said that was the plan. Last spring, Emma's daughter, she is 11 years old and her name is Ruth, after Eunice's mother, asked her grandmother what was in the drawer. Emma took her to the desk and opened the bottom drawer and took out the book and sat down with Ruth on the old sofa and read her the opening pages, the ones where Eunice explained why she was keeping the book. Eunice had written, in 1912, in the careful hand of a woman who knew her handwriting would have to carry the meaning without her voice to support it. I am writing this down because I have learned things that I do not want to lose, and I'm not young enough to assume I will always be here to teach them. If you are reading this and I am gone, please read carefully. I tried to be accurate. I tried to be honest about what I did not know as well as what I did. If something here does not match what you have learned from other sources, do not discard it without testing it first. The ground is the test. The animals are the test. Go look. Ruth listened to all of that without fidgeting. Then she said, "Grandma, can I write in it too?" Emma looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, but only in pencil, and only what you've actually seen yourself." Ruth said, "Okay." Emma handed her the book. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for someone to open the drawer and remember why they were written down in the first place. And some knowledge doesn't travel through institutions or journals or conferences. It travels through families, through drawers, through the handwriting of women who were paying attention when nobody was watching, passed forward to hands that are small enough to hold a pencil, but old enough to understand that the ground is the test, and the animals are the test. And if you want to know something true, you go look. That's what Ununice Williams knew. That's what she wrote down. That's what the drawer kept until the animals started dying and a 24-year-old boy said, "Dad, what about Grandma Eunice's book?" And that's what Ruth Williams is going to add to, in pencil, on the pages that still have room, in the farmhouse in Ringgold County where the knowledge has always lived.